Hello, and welcome to Rallying for Rail. In my last video, I addressed the narrative that America's passenger rail is doomed to mediocrity because of its low population density. I don't believe that this should be a reason for America's passenger rail woes. However, I said in that video that there are other reasons for America not having a great passenger rail system. And I want to address those reasons, or at least the reasons I'm aware of based on my own research. It's going to take 2, possibly more, videos for me to address those reasons, but one of the videos is this one. Possibly the biggest reason for our mediocre passenger rail system in the United States, in my opinion, could be said in 2 words: freight rail. But why is freight rail Amtrak's biggest obstacle to good service? There are 3 reasons that I can think of, and I'll get to those reasons in a bit. But all the reasons circle around one piece of context. The context is that Amtrak doesn't own most of the tracks it runs on. In fact, Amtrak only owns about 3% of the 21,400 miles it runs on, and almost none of the trackage outside of the Northeast Corridor is owned by Amtrak. Rather, most of the tracks Amtrak runs on are owned by freight rail companies such as Norfolk Southern and Union Pacific. And the fact that Amtrak runs on so much track not owned by the entity itself causes problems. The first problem is monetary. Amtrak has often been criticized for not making a profit and therefore needing significant government subsidies in order to balance its books. However, they are not exactly helped by the fact that they have to pay these freight rail companies in order to run on their tracks. According to Amtrak themselves, they pay $142 million yearly to operate on freight rail tracks and infrastructure. Now, that doesn't explain away the entire $757 million deficit Amtrak had in 2023. But that does account for nearly a fifth of the deficit, which is not insignificant. I don't know where that $142 million would go if Amtrak didn't have to pay it to freight rail companies. But even if not paying this insane amount only resulted in fewer government subsidies, the lower subsidies could at least create some goodwill that makes certain politicians more willing to throw their support and money behind improvements to Amtrak than currently. And even if that best case scenario didn't happen, well, at least it's $142 million that doesn't have to get spent by the government. And that's not a bad thing. Another problem created by the tracks the freight rail companies own is that many of them are single-tracked, as opposed to having 2 sets of tracks running parallel to each other. As to why these freight rail companies have single-track lines, I don't know. Maybe the thought is that it would save money if they didn't build a second set of tracks? I'm just guessing here, honestly. But regardless of the reason for all these single-track lines, the results are undeniable. There is no opportunity to pass a freight rail train if Amtrak gets stuck behind a freight rail train, and it also means that the operating capacity of the Amtrak service is significantly reduced. As a side note, the single-track nature in many areas also reduces capacity for freight rail, so I think it hurts freight rail too. Many transit nerds like me want more Amtrak service, but it's hard to get that service when so much Amtrak service only has 1 track to run on. The third issue is that, in spite of a law saying that passenger rail gets priority on rail tracks, the law is not enforced and is often ignored by freight rail companies. What it means is that freight rail companies often prioritize their own trains on their own tracks, contrary to what the law says. And because freight rail companies prioritize their own trains over Amtrak trains, the Amtrak trains are often delayed quite significantly by freight rail. And these freight train interferences, as Amtrak calls them, are the number one cause of delays for Amtrak. In terms of solutions to these issues, I've heard talk of the aforementioned law being enforced more. At one point, that was the hope and desire I felt. But greater enforcement would create a new potential dilemma. If the law is enforced too strictly, would it create a toxic dynamic between Amtrak and the freight rail companies? I could see it create a dynamic through which freight rail companies would be like, forget it. We're not going to have Amtrak on our tracks if our trains have to wait for the Amtrak trains. Am I worrying too much? I honestly don't know. I've also seen suggestions that America should nationalize its network of rail tracks. That is an interesting idea for sure. I sense that the freight rail industry would absolutely hate this. But at the same time, I think that it would solve the issue of Amtrak having to pay to use tracks. It might even mean that Amtrak gets priority over freight rail in some cases, where they haven't gotten priority in the past. Both things would be good, which is part of why I would support nationalizing our rail system, or at least our rail tracks and infrastructure. There are other reasons I support nationalizing our rails, but those other reasons would get off topic from this video. But if we don't nationalize our rail system, we in the United States at least need to stop living under the illusion that passenger and freight rail can easily coexist as it stands. We have tried this experiment for decades, and the experiment has failed. We need more Amtrak dedicated tracks if we want the high-class passenger rail in the United States that we deserve. Now, Amtrak's tracks being built won't be cheap or easy. I'm guessing that land would need to be acquired in certain cases for this, and that's going to be no easy task. It will also cost money, for I'm reading that in many cases, building rail costs between $1 million and $3 million per mile. That's not cheap. But if we want the sort of passenger rail we deserve in the United States, I think it's an important step. So, what are your thoughts on Amtrak's freight rail issue? Are there other problems with freight rail and how it impacts Amtrak service that I forgot to cover in this video? Do you have other solutions in mind? Feel free to comment on that in the comment section below. Also, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Thank you, and have a good day.